chat. Great. My name is Annie Ayers. I'm a local botanist and a board member, and I'm really pleased to introduce a friend and colleague, Alejandro Lemus. And Alejandro holds a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from the University of California, Los Angeles. After graduating in 2018, Alejandro worked as a stewardship technician on the Palos Verdes Peninsula down in Los Angeles County, working on habitat restoration and conservation projects. After discovering a love for the native plant nursery and propagation, Alejandro spent years working at the Theodore Payne Foundation for Wildflowers and Native Plants, a nonprofit retail nursery and education center. During this time, Alejandro worked in the nursery educating the public on the benefits of native plant gardening, served as an instructor for the California Native Plant Landscaper Certification Program, and propagated plants for the retail nursery, living collections, and contracts. Currently, Alejandro works at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, we're very lucky, as the horticulture educator. In this role, Alejandro is excited to continue sharing his love for California's diverse flora and empowering landscapers to work with native plants. And we're really excited that that role is blending into his time here with us. So thank you, Alejandro. I really look forward to hearing what you have to share.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Annie. Hello, everyone. My name is Alejandro Lemus, and as Annie mentioned, I'm the horticultural educator at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. And I just want to say thank you so much to the Channel Islands chapter of CMPS for having me this evening and for letting me speak to the audience. I'm really excited to talk about native plants. As I mentioned, I'm the horticultural educator at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, but most importantly, I am a jardinero. So I'm a gardener at heart. I love gardening. I love working with native plants, and I'm excited to tell you about some of my favorite native plants for the landscape and what the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden is doing to deliver this information, not only to residential gardeners and enthusiastic native plant experts, but also the workforce. So who are the people actively putting plants into the ground and maintaining them? We also want to make sure that they have this information and it's available for them to care for native plant landscapes. So I'm excited to be here this evening. Thank you so much. All right. So I just want to start off with a little bit about myself, tell you about how I'm here, what am I doing here, who is this guy? But my name is, like I said, Alejandro Lemus. If folks are familiar with the genus Lemus, as in Lemus condensatus, one of my favorite giant wild ryegrasses, similar to my last name, so I always get a kick of a kick out of including the Y there. So it's very close to Lemus. Pronouns he, him. But I am from South Central Los Angeles, now living up here in Santa Barbara, working for the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. And if folks are familiar with South Central Los Angeles, it's a part of Los Angeles that pretty much is void of any kind of green space. It's a food desert, not a lot of access to natural spaces. So I was very lucky that my parents, both of them, were and still are jardineros or yarderos or landscapers. So I actually grew up working and helping them with their business. And that was actually my taste of nature, where I got curious about invertebrates, learning more about insects, seeing flowers, pricking my delicate little fingers on thorns and bleeding and experiencing that for the first time. It's all great. It built so much character in me. So I'm very grateful that I had those experiences. And really, it's those experiences that instilled my curiosity for the natural world that made me want to study ecology and biology when I had the privilege of going to school. So I received my Bachelor's of Science in 2018 from UCLA, and I've been working with native plants since in different capacities. So I'm excited to tell you about that story, but I think what better way to talk about it than just showing you some pictures. I'm a visual learner, but essentially this is my journey. I started working in 2018 for the Palos Verdes Land Conservancy, which I think this picture up here tells that story, which is just me and a group of people, very excited, passionate folks working on conservation projects, habitat restoration projects for the endangered Palos Verdes blue butterfly, the El Segundo blue butterfly, the cactus wren, really doing habitat restoration for endangered species. And I was also caring for trails. So this was my life back in 2018, 2019, early 2020. And then the pandemic happened and I got really sad. I'm like, oh, I don't have a job anymore, but I'm still curious about native plants. So I got into photography. So all of these pictures I've taken, or I know the people who've taken them, but I took this picture of this monarch butterfly in 2020. And it just got me thinking about wildlife and native plants and how we can invite native plants into our yards. Then we have this picture of my mom here. One of our favorite plants is the wisteria plants. And like I mentioned, I grew up landscaping with my parents. So these are some of my memories of the garden and my interactions with the natural world, really just hanging out with my parents, my family, and doing this kind of work. And they still do this kind of work, which is badass. It's really cool. And then a couple years later, I'm working for the Theodore Payne Nursery. Theodore Payne Nursery, as Annie mentioned, nonprofit retail center and education center, where I learned a lot about propagating plants. So you see me up here talking to the public about native plants and how do you propagate native plants from cuttings. And I'm so thankful for my experiences at Theodore Payne. Because I learned a lot about what I like to do. And what I like to do is I like to talk to people about native plants. How do you engage and get people excited about native plant horticulture? So I saw this really exciting and promising position open up at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. They were looking for a horticultural educator, and I was thinking to myself, that sounds exactly like me. I need to apply, and this needs to be my life. So I'm grateful to now be up here in Santa Barbara. This picture of me is a picture of me teaching at the garden, leading people through our gardens, talking about native plant horticulture. So I'm very excited to be here. And then as much as I love showing pictures, I also just before we get into like the nitty gritty of what native plant horticulture is and get into all the exciting details, I just want you all to think about the ways that native plants intersect with your lives. So take a moment, think about it. But as I was putting together this PowerPoint, I started to think about the ways native plants have influenced me and the people around me, and the people around me that I think of as my family. You know, my family back in LA. So these are pictures of my family members, myself, and my pets. There's little my dog Domino, black and white little poodle, interacting with plants. You know, so both of my parents really love Ceanothus Ray Hartman. So I really love this picture here of us interacting with the plant. So experiencing joy around the plant, but it's one of my parents' favorite native plants, the Ray Hartman California lilac. I remember every year when I still lived in LA, my dad would ask, the Ceanothus está floreando? The Ceanothus? I'm like, yes, yes, pa, Ceanothus is blooming. So it just goes to show, you know, how much of an influence native plants have on us and the ways they can bring us so much joy, not only to ourselves for mental health purposes, but also all the benefits that they provide wildlife. We keep talking about promoting biodiversity as our initiatives at the garden, and what's going to help us accomplish that, really putting native plants in the ground and increasing their coverage. So I want this to be fun for people. I want gardening to feel accessible, and I want it to feel that there's many ways you can engage with native plants. You know, I think there's people who appreciate the edible qualities of native plants. Like this picture down here, my mom and I remember we were harvesting some elderberry fruits from one of our trees, and that's one way that we interact with native plants. So just I want to ask you that question. Think about ways that you're interacting with native plants or how native plants intersect into various aspects of your life. My sister's a big fan of the bush sunflower, which you can see in this picture here. I often tell her to pose for pictures. I don't know if she likes that, but I enjoy it very much. So I'm here representing the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. So our mission is to conserve native plants and habitats for the health of well-being in our planet. So I just want to provide a brief history of the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden and the various accomplishments that the garden has accomplished over its years as a garden. But the Botanic Garden was founded in 1926 as the first U.S. Botanic Garden dedicated to native plants. Um, and at the Botanic Garden, you know, we focus on so many aspects of plants, you know, from conservation, research, horticulture, putting these plants in the ground as a demonstration to people, as creating a landscape that inspires people, but also not just inspiring people to keep coming back to the garden, but also empowering them to also do native plant gardening. You know, we want our garden to not only just be this beautiful landscape that people visit every spring and they leave inspired, but we also want to make sure that they feel empowered to do this kind of work, you know. And I understand that not everyone has the privilege and access to a front yard that they can transform. But I've done this in containers, in apartment buildings, very small spaces where you can start to garden with native plants. So that's what we really want to encourage folks, especially the community, to do through our public education classes, through outreach, like talking to the CMPS folks tonight. So again, I'm very thankful that I have this platform to discuss the work that we're doing at the Botanic Garden to make native plants and native plant knowledge much more accessible. And with over 30 plant introductions to the horticultural trade, you may be familiar with plants like Verbena delamina, Salvia Pacific Blue. Those are Santa Barbara Botanic Garden introductions, and they've been introduced into the native plant community. So we've done a lot. We've done a lot. So what is our vision for the future? So we have strategic plan. We have a strategic plan, and some of those goals include increasing the native plant coverage in Santa Barbara County to 30%. So making sure that we can accomplish 30% native plant coverage in the built environment. So that means getting plants out into the public, putting them in the ground, this either in schools, public landscapes. We want to make sure that native plants are able to thrive and promote that habitat. Maintain biodiversity. We're seeing nowadays climate change, it's very much real. Models are predicting that it's only going to get hotter, it's going to get drier, and our fire season is going to be a lot more heightened. And those are threats to biodiversity. And what better way to make sure that biodiversity thrives in the face of these threats? Planting native plants and making sure people know how to care for native plants so that they thrive and they create that habitat. And most importantly, we want to make sure that this work is driven into the next generation. We want to make sure that we're inspiring a new generation of conservation leaders. So getting more native plants into the built environment. There are some crucial challenges. First is client awareness, right? We want people to be asking for native plants. When people are considering transforming their landscape, we want native plants to be at the front of their mind. So we want to make sure that there's this client awareness. We want to increase client awareness. Plant availability. There may be that client awareness. Maybe a client is talking to their landscape designer about plants, native plants that they want to install in their front yard or in their landscape. The landscape designer or, whoever goes to the nursery and they cannot find these plants because these plants aren't commonly available at commercial stores like Home Depot or Lowe's. You usually have to visit smaller nurseries, smaller retail nurseries. And even then you run into a bottleneck where they may not have the plant available or they just sold out of plants. And then there's that production bottleneck. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about ways to make these plants available to the public or more readily available to the public. And then care and maintenance expertise. So I think oftentimes we think, oh, you put a native plant in the ground and it's going to thrive. You did a good thing. That's true. You did do a good thing, but you also have to think about what is it going to take to get that plant established? What does watering look like in that first year? What does watering look like after year 3? When do you start to prune that plant? How do you prune that plant? You start to see the plant browning in the summer. Is that normal? Does that mean the plant's dying? Dormancy? What's dormancy? So many questions that people have. So oftentimes we run into this thing where, good intentioned horticulturists, landscapers are possess the knowledge, possess horticultural skill, but they're needing that extra bump of information about native plant horticulture. Because it's not to say that they don't have the skills, but sometimes with native plant horticulture, the care for these native plants is a little more nuanced and a little more seasonal, and they require water at different times of year. So that is one of the things we're looking to address at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. We want to make sure that this information is available to the workforce. So I'm really excited to talk to you all about a little program that could, the California Native Plant Landscaper Certification. So this curriculum was developed by California Native Plant Society and the Theodore Payne Foundation, and it is being licensed to this growing network of institutions that are offering these trainings in their respective communities. So Santa Barbara Botanic Garden has since taught one cohort, currently teaching one cohort right now. Chino Basin Water Conservation District down in the Inland Empire has taught a couple cohorts. Our partners over at Ojai Valley Land Conservancy have also delivered a cohort of the CMPLC program. So we're starting to expand the reach of this program and make sure that it is a coast or a statewide program that landscapers and folks who are working with native plants have access to. And this is a picture of me. I believe this must be the summer of 2022 when we actually delivered this content to the UCLA landscapers during my time with the Theodore Payne Foundation. So it was really cool. My alma mater is UCLA, so it was cool to be back at these spots that I frequented as an undergrad and seeing the native plant crew there or the landscaping crew there really taking ownership of the native plants, really demonstrating excitement and curiosity for learning how to care for these plants. And creating habitat on campus. So that was a really cool full circle moment for me just to see their excitement, especially we were teaching them about native plants and their horticulture in the very gardens that they actually did work. So that was very empowering to see that, just teaching them and also learning a lot from them. I went into these classes telling people that, I may be tasked as being the instructor, but I'm here to learn just as much from you as you think that you're going to learn from me. So it was a very collaborative environment, and I'm very grateful for those experiences. So at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, we've been able to offer one cohort. We have since graduated 24 graduates, landscape designers, consultants, park rangers who now have this knowledge and are going to implement these skills into their work. But essentially, our landscaper certification program is 19 hours of instruction. We cover everything from plant ID, soils, irrigation, integrated pest management, weeding, pruning. We talk about it all. Like that's a lot to talk about in 19 hours. So I always tell people this is only the start of your education about native plants. I always tell people the best way to learn how to do gardening is to get your hands dirty, make mistakes when you're pruning, seeing how the plants respond, and actually getting that hands-on experience with the native plants, which we strive to deliver that kind of learning experience through the landscaper certification. So here are enthusiastic UCLA landscapers showing off their new certificates after a really fun summer talking about native plants. Then we've also worked with the USC crew. So you can imagine how silly I felt when I walked into USC, the USC landscaping offices that first day. And the first thing I say is, I'm a UCLA Bruin. Oh, they heckled me so much, but I did it for a reason. I did it to break the ice so that they could laugh at me and feel like, hey, this guy can take a joke, and create an environment that felt comfortable and conducive to learning, making mistakes, asking questions. So I really like this picture. I'm so grateful to Marie who took this picture. But this is us talking about some of the native plants that are at USC. These plants are very much in the sections that these landscapers are tasked to care for. So you can see that we were talking, this is the heat of, this must be the height of summer in 2022, but we're talking about California buckwheat and how the flowers are starting to brown. You can also see some California fuchsia there. So really starting to think about how are you maintaining these plants in the summer? How are you watering them in the summer? Here we have one of the landscapers shearing Palmer's mallow, a Butylon palmerae. So you can see it's a shrub, it's blooming, it's pretty overgrown, and we're just getting in there with the plants. Again, this is the way, in my experience, and I'm sure others can relate, to really learn about native plant care. You have to get in there and you have to do this kind of work. So I really appreciate that we were able to do this kind of training at the garden sites that the USC crew worked on. Fight on. So I'm really proud of this. And I'm glad that I'm now up at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, continuing to grow this message, continuing to grow this content. So as I mentioned, what has been the impact so far up here at the garden? So 24 people have been certified so far, including landscape designers, park rangers, professional landscapers, and enthused residential gardeners. There's many more cohorts coming this year. We're currently in the middle of our May cohort, but we definitely will have a summer and fall cohort. In fact, there are dates for our summer cohort available on our website. So if you're interested, I highly recommend checking out our calendar on the garden's website. All right, so I do want to transition, and I did promise that we would talk about Alejandro's native plants for the landscape. So I'm going to transition gears here for a bit and talk about what are some of the most reliable native plants that we can utilize for the landscapes. What can you utilize for the front yard? What can you utilize for the harsh parkway, the public landscape, commercial gardening? How can we get native plants out there? All right, so I'm excited to talk to you about this a bit. And again, I do want to say if folks have questions, feel free to drop some questions in the chat. I always like getting questions in the chat, but I will try my best to make space, maybe 5 to 10 minutes towards the end to engage in some discussion or answer some questions. So I definitely want to be conscientious of that. So let's get started. So before you even put plants in the ground, this is just a little taste of what some of our of the curriculum of our landscaper certification, what we try to impart to people when it comes to plant selection. You really want to assess your site. What are the sun-shade patterns that you're noticing? What texture soils do you have? How fast or how slow do your soil drain? Topography, do you notice grade? Is there inclines? Are there slopes? Because all of those topographical changes or topographical features are going to create microclimates, sometimes unique microclimates in your garden that are going to lend themselves well to specific plant palette over others. So really starting to understand microclimates in your garden and what is the general climate and rainfall pattern of your area. And when you have a better understanding of how much rain you receive during the winter season, that really helps inform the kind of plants you can put in the ground. What does your plant palette look like? And how are you watering those plants during the dry season? So site analysis, you can also take a biotic inventory. Take a look at what is existing on your property. What are some existing plants that you want to play off of? What are some native plants that you can introduce into the landscape that'll complement those existing plants? And also just taking analysis or taking inventory of insects that visit your garden, birds, reptiles, amphibians, even mammals. Really starting to think about how a well-designed garden can be inviting to wildlife. And what does a well-designed garden look like? So we really encourage folks to take a moment to analyze their site. And then I just want to highlight a couple tools here for identifying those sunshade patterns. But there's this really great resource, findmyshadow.com, for you to start to take a look at how the sun patterns change throughout the day, but also through the seasons. There's some tools for investigating topography on your landscape, and also some information here, some really great resources for starting to record um, observations in your place or on your property. What are some wildlife observations? What are observations of plants that you can make? Which wildlife is utilizing your plants, utilizing your landscape? So I definitely want to recommend resources like iNaturalist and eBird to start to record those observations. Another one of my favorite tools for demonstrating and communicating native plant horticulture to people are native plants for the Southern California Garden flashcards. So it's one of my favorite resources because it has pictures, it's both in English and Spanish, and it's really easy to understand. But if you're not familiar with these flashcards, this is what they look like, and they provide relevant horticultural information for over 50 native species and cultivars. So it's what I think, and in my opinion, an excellent tool for discussing native plants with the public and or your clients if you're working with people. But you can see, for example, for the penstemon card, it'll have plenty of pictures of penstemon, both species and selections or hybrids. Um, we'll include some information, some horticultural information at the top about what watering looks like for the plant after it's established, the sun or shade it prefers, the soil drainage it prefers, and then also a blurb about the plant on the back, uh, some icons here that help you understand if it's a butterfly plant, if it's suitable for a container or appropriate for a hummingbird garden, and also an estimate of what the height by width looks like for that plant. So really great resource. So I always like to say, before you start to think about putting plants in the ground, don't fight the site. Don't fight the site, you know? Let the river take you in one direction. Don't fight the current. Let it take you where it's going to take you, you know, and that's the way I like to approach gardening. Don't fight the site. A good understanding of your site's sun exposure, soil drainage, and microclimates will allow you to select the best native plants for your garden. So I always say it's better to select plants that are well adapted to your site as opposed to amending your site to fit the specific requirements of a few plants. So that is my take, but I'm open to discussion there. Don't fight the site. So how do you start to get inspiration for native plants? Where do you go to see native plants? And I just want to present you with a couple slides here about what I consider to be some inspiring landscapes, but you can ignore this man here. I don't know who he is. I hope they're not on like they're stepping on the wildflowers, but I have a feeling that they're using like a spur trail. They're definitely not stepping on wildflowers. But this is a field of hillside daisy or the Monolopia lanceolata, which on good rain years can carpet the Carrizo Plain and the adjacent hillsides with this yellow flower, which for a moment you kind of have to do a double take because you may think it's black mustard, but it's not black mustard. It's a native. Lupins, moody lupins at an open field at Tejon Ranch. And this one here is our miniature lupin, our Lupinus bicolor. Really excellent annual to include in the garden. Poppies, we're all fans of the poppies. Poppies brighten up a spring day. Clarkias in pastel pink. And then one of my favorite places to seek inspiration, even in the middle of the work week, I can just stare at this place for hours. So Santa Barbara Botanic Gardens Meadow. Please stay on the path. But this is a really excellent resource. So I mentioned these landscapes um, because oftentimes it's really important to look towards plant communities for plant inspiration. How are these plants growing in nature? So I often find myself going on hikes, visiting natural spaces, visiting botanic gardens, local parks to see how native plants are being utilized. So I think the meadow is such a great example. I always am pleased looking at it. Right now, it's currently blooming with these tidy tips, which actually may be going to seed pretty soon, but we're actually are starting to see the appearance of our punch bowl Clarkia or the Clarkia botte that's carpeting the center of the meadow. And there's also these wonderful yarrow plants, both the island pink and the straight species, but they're wonderful, wonderful plants for attracting pollinators, all kinds of invertebrates that are doing their part in the ecosystem. So Again, I mentioned this as just one resource or one way for finding inspiration on how to use native plants. So this is one slide that I put together just for you to start to think about, where do you see native plants? How are native plants being utilized in your area? And these are just some pictures that I pulled together. But when I lived in LA, the Manhattan Beach Botanical Garden was such a beautiful place to look at native plants and seeing native plants being utilized in an urban setting. Up here in Santa Barbara, these two verbenas are actually planted at La Colina Junior High, a school that is actively doing work to increase their native plant coverage on campus, and actually including the help of students to help steward these plants. You got this monkey flower with signage that's helping people understand what the flower is. What do you mean that flower is super beneficial to hummingbirds? Just like the native plants that I see on my walks here in Santa Barbara, I oftentimes forget that everything is 10 to 15 minutes away here, including really cool natural spaces. So I have to remind myself to frequent these spaces and give myself proper time in nature. But also remembering that conservation, especially community-based conservation, includes people. So I just also wanted to highlight landscapers like Carlos, who works at La Colina Junior High, who are actively caring for these native plants that are being put in the ground. So making sure that our gardeners are not excluded from this, from what we call the conservation movement. You know, conservation, it may be a field of work, a field of study for people, but if it includes all of us, it's a movement, and conservation is a movement. And I'd also just want to highlight one of the Botanic Gardens projects at Elings Park in collaboration with Channel Islands Restoration to plant native plants and remove invasive species from the park and create a habitat for wildlife, while also testing out some science there, doing some science experiment and seeing what are the appropriate methods for ecological restoration, and what does a plant palette for further down south mean when it's planted up in Santa Barbara. How can we create a habitat that's resilient, especially as we face human-induced climate change? So this is what conservation looks like to me. This is what habitat restoration looks like to me. This is what the native plant movement looks like to me. It includes all of us. I often like to say two things. Conservation without including the community isn't conservation. It is conservation to some, but it has to include the community. There has to be that stewardship component. And I also like to say that native plants do not know borders. Native plants know suitable habitats and suitable niches, but they do not recognize man-made lines. All right. So I want to get into the nitty-gritty. All right. What are some of Alejandro's favorite native plants? And I can approach this by just spitting a list of plants to people, but I like to approach recommending plants in terms of how you can use these plants to achieve a certain function. And I think one of the most popular questions we get at the Botanic Garden and just through my years of working with the public and helping them connect with native plants is, Alejandro, I want to tear out my lawn. I want grass. Okay, so you want a ground cover. And there are many ways you can achieve a ground cover. You can use grasses, as I'm going to discuss now. You can use herbaceous perennials, which I'm going to discuss in a bit. Or you can also use woody shrubs that don't tolerate foot traffic, but they can also be used to create coverage and cover the ground. So I'd like to introduce a couple of my favorite grasses and grass-like plants that we can utilize for lawn replacements. These tolerate light foot traffic, and you can treat them as turf. You can actually mow these back. You can hack them back with a weed whacker every month or every maybe a few times a year to keep them low, but also regenerate these plants. So our grasses here in California are actually split into two categories. We have cool season grasses and we have warm season grasses. And I actually want to highlight a beautiful warm season grass right now. This one here is our blue grama grass, or the Bouteloua gracilis. If you have visited the Santa Barbara Botanic Gardens meadow, this is the primary grass, the primary bunch grass that's planted in the center of the meadow. I especially like this plant because after it's established, it's extremely drought tolerant. It can tolerate mowing, foot traffic. Our meadow gardener Christine has oftentimes, with their permission, said, "Alejandro, come see what's in the center of the meadow." And I tell Christine, "Are you sure? I'm gonna step on the plants." And she's like, "You have my permission, and you know that it can tolerate foot traffic." And then I know everything's okay. So blue grama grass, it's often one that you can plant in the warm season from small containers, either a 2-inch, 4-inch, or 1-gallon plant, or even plug size, or you can seed this grass in the warm season. So really great grass. And you can see that has an attractive seed head. It almost resembles little eyebrows. You know, it's really beautiful. Really tough grass here. Another grass-like plant I want to highlight that we actually utilize at the Botanic Garden to achieve more of a ground cover look is our clustered field sedge, or the Carex praegracilis. You can find it in two locations at the Botanic Garden. So this is actually the north side of the caretaker's cottage at the Botanic Garden, which is home to the home demonstration garden. But you can see here it's being utilized as a low ground cover. It does appreciate a bit of moisture in the summertime, but with that, you can see it stays green. It may brown in the summertime if it doesn't have enough water, but it makes an excellent grass-like ground cover. And you can see when you're planting them, you can plant them pretty densely so that you achieve that uniform coverage. I've planted them from a small plug, or have even seeded them in a prepared site. And this is an example, a photograph taken by a horticulturist, Carol Bornstein, of a Carex praegracilis lawn that's kept low and mowed much more frequently. So ground cover, but this time we're going to talk about achieving ground cover using herbaceous perennials. So just take a look at how beautiful that penstemon is. It's so electrically blue. Maybe it's called, what is it called? Penstemon electric blue. So I want to show you how you can utilize herbaceous ground covers as a small scale ground cover. So I'm talking about plants that can be planted in mass, that provide seasonal interest, that have beautiful flowers, and that also attract many, many pollinators. So I want to highlight Achillea, penstemon, origeron, our seaside daisies, iris, monkey flowers, and also our California fuchsia. So let me highlight a couple of those. Again, really spectacular image from the Botanic Gardens meadow, utilizing the island pink selection of the Achillea millefolium, or the yarrow. It's one of my favorite flowers, comes in usually white or this pink variety. But again, it's a really great butterfly plant. It's gonna invite all kinds of invertebrates. And you can actually keep this plant cut pretty low if you want to achieve more of a lawn replacement. But again, that does come at the expense of flowers. So just look at how beautiful that is. And in the summertime, you actually see the seed heads turn this rusty brown color. And oftentimes gardeners are like, oh, Alejandro, what's happening? The flowers are turning brown. What's going on? Am I doing the right thing? And I usually tell them, relax, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. So this is just an excellent example of really showcasing to people the habitat value of the plant. You know, the plant is providing habitat when it's in bloom, it's providing nectar and pollen to critters, but also these seeds that it produces are also going to be a form of sustenance for other forms of life, and actually will help the plant reseed itself in the garden if that's something that you desire. So again, I usually like to say that brown is a color, and we need to start appreciating it in our California landscapes. California fuchsia, folks are familiar with this one. You get these red tubular flowers in the summertime, usually in the heat of summer. So if you're looking to achieve year-round color in a native plant garden, I definitely recommend including several plants of the California fuchsia. And again, these are herbaceous perennials that can be used to cover ground, but may not be the most durable ground cover that tolerates foot traffic. So please keep that in mind. Seaside daisies, they do super well here in Santa Barbara County, Ventura counties, because we're so coastal. I've seen seaside daisies mass planted. You get these beautiful lavender flowers with the yellow center in the springtime, and they actually make really wonderful container plants. So speaking of container plants, I really like our Dudleya. So this is an example of the island green Dudleya, or Dudleya virens subspecies insularis, actually being used as a ground cover underneath our black oak at the garden, so our Quercus cologii. It's really interesting to see that some Dudleya can actually be a ground cover. So this is a branching form of the Dudleya. But Dudleya is a really cool plant. Unfortunately, California doesn't really have a lot of diversity when it comes to succulents. You know, we have our Dudleya, Lewisias, sedum, some other succulents. Please let me know if I'm missing any. But there's not a whole lot of succulent diversity. But what I will say, that Dudleya has its diversity mostly in California. So you do find some on the islands, you do find some in the desert, but most of the range of the Dudleya is actually restricted to coastal California. So I'm not sure if folks are familiar. I think many people will be familiar with this, but I also just want to share that, you know, Dudleya is a conservation hero. It is a plant that, unfortunately, because of its ease of transportation and its ease of accessibility in the wild, unfortunately, it is a plant that is poached. But there are laws and regulations being passed to protect this plant, and also really important work that botanic gardens are doing to properly display this species. So if folks ever frequent the Botanic Garden, we actually have just installed our Dudleya display, which showcases Dudleya from different parts of California and also shares that story of how important it is to protect and conserve this species. So I definitely recommend and encourage folks to check out the Botanic Garden's newly installed Dudleya display. And also just appreciate the many ways that Dudleya can lend a hand in the landscape. And this is some of my favorite pictures of Dudleya that I've gardened with in containers. So again, you don't need to have a huge front yard. This is something that you can participate with a container. There's so many ways that you can engage with native plants. So this is a Dudleya viscida, or the sticky Dudleya. The little stinky too. It smells like tar to me, or resinous, but I really love this Dudleya. Oops. And this is another Dudleya that I have that I think does spectacularly in a container. This is the giant chalk Dudleya, or the Dudleya pulverulenta, which is actually native to the Santa Monica Mountains. So really beautiful gray-green rosette. I absolutely love Dudleya in a container. So make sure you get some Dudleya in the garden from a reputable native plant nursery. We are trying our best to make this plant much more available in the trade so that people aren't poaching or having to go into the wild to collect plants. So ground cover using low woody shrubs. So these help provide coverage, but as I mentioned, these do not tolerate foot traffic, but they're great at providing green cover in the garden. So one of my favorite plants is the Baccharis, the coyote brush. As you can see there, a lot of them have a huge spread. They stay green year round. After they're established, they're mostly drought tolerant, really don't require a lot of water. This is a beautiful specimen at the Botanic Garden, a selection of the Baccharis known as Santa Ana. And you can see it's mounding, it's prostrate. So it actually is a lot wider than it is tall. And it actually produces these beautiful white fluffy seed heads in the summertime. So just really talking and emphasizing that habitat value that these plants bring and the joy that they bring humans. Look at how happy that guy is. Ceanothus Yankee Point, one of my favorite California lilacs. This is actually from UCSB, some of the landscaping on the campus there. So you can see they got some Yankee Point ceanothus, utilizing it as a mounding shrub. I especially love these ground cover varieties of ceanothus because of the glossy green leaves. Just look at this close up here. Just a spectacular plant. Really beautiful purple lilac blue flowers in the springtime. Really comes alive with pollinators. All right. How am I doing on time, y'all? What time is it?
7:42.
7:42. All right. So let me we'll try to wrap up around 7:50. So I got some time for some questions. But I just want to also share a couple of other shrubs. So let's graduate to medium shrubs. So let's talk about shrubs that we can use for the landscape that are maybe around 3 to 5 feet tall, just as wide, that I think are super reliable in the landscape and that every native plant landscape needs. So good, again, these are good focal shrubs that you can use for mass planting and also flowers. So California buckwheat, Eriogonum fasciculatum, our buckwheats are just now getting started, some of the earliest buckwheats, but these are plants that are just quintessential California. They're iconic to California. You find them in almost every kind of habitat except wet areas here in Western North America. But it's a beautiful, beautiful plant. Just talking about a pollinator magnet. These really brighten up the landscape in the heat of summer and then offer this beautiful rusty brown color as the season changes to fall. So it really is a shrub that I think encompasses the spirit and the seasonality of our California climate and our California plant communities. White sage. We love sage. I think no landscape is complete without a sage. And also, I also want to highlight sage, especially the white sage, is a plant worth noting about its conservation. You know, maybe people have heard stories about people going out into wild areas and poaching sage. And we want to promote that message that this is a plant that can be easily cultivated in your landscaping. We want to be sure that folks are informed on how to grow it from seed, how easy it is to start it from seed, um, how we can work to promote more plants in the nursery or have more plants available in the nursery. But it's unfortunate to learn. It's unfortunate to learn how much of this plant is poached in the wild. But one message that I do want to impart on people this evening is grow your own. Grow your own white sage. You know, I'm actually starting some white sage in my backyard in seed trays, and I just noticed this morning that the seeds are popping up. I was like, this is so easy. I want to tell people about it. So this is me telling you about it. Grow your own white sage. It's cool. You'll be cool. Pink flowered currant or the Ribes sanguineum. So talking about plants for an oak woodland garden or much a shade garden, I think Ribes are oftentimes the unsung heroes of the landscape. Just talk about a shrub that's going to provide so much habitat for our seed-eating birds. Ribes sanguineum especially is a beautiful woodland shrub that brightens up even the darkest corners of a landscape or a garden, especially with those pink flowers. So large shrubs and trees. So these are shrubs and trees that you can use for creating native screens and hedges, maybe creating some privacy from that neighbor you don't like. It's okay, we all have them. You can create a windbreak, create a much more controlled environment. These help prevent erosion. So they really help with curbing erosion and providing some of that erosion control. And habitat, they help provide habitat. So some of my favorite shrubs that I like to see included in landscapes, especially in urban environments, is the toyon. The heteromeles arbutifolia. It's a great plant, provides these winter red berries for wildlife, and also really easy to get established and takes pruning and shearing really well. So it's a native plant that, in my opinion, is really adaptable to the urban built environment. There's many ways that this shrub can adapt to those conditions. Sumacs, looking to our native plants, not just our native plants, but our locally occurring native plants. So seeing what's growing in the chaparral, what's growing in the coastal sage scrub, and how we can bring those ideas into the urban environment. So lemonade berry is a great one. Just look at those sticky fruits. I'm getting hungry just looking at them. I just want to put them in my mouth right now, but I can't do that. Mountain mahogany. If you see mountain mahogany in the nursery, don't be afraid. Utilize it. It's such a great screening plant. I especially love the mountain mahogany because of its vase shape. It's very upright. So you can actually plant them very close to each other to achieve this uniform hedge. I would say they're moderate growers, but once you get them established, they're absolutely gorgeous shrubs. They are native to the chaparral, and I especially like our local Cercocarpus or the mountain mahogany or Cercocarpus betuloides because after it's bloomed, it produces these feathery seed heads that almost glisten or that are backlit by the sun. So in addition to having so much landscape value, it really is just a gorgeous plant that is providing beauty and creating habitat. Salt bush, or our quail bush, some people will call it. It's a great one. I want to see this one included more often in the landscape, but this is our Atriplex lentiformis. It's a really great bird shrub. This one we have at the garden in the Meadowview area, the north end of our meadow. And this is where you can usually see the little quail families walking around or the quail singing. So it's a really cool shrub, really easy to grow. I've hedged this plant before, I've sheared this plant before, and it comes back very reliably. It's one that I would love to see included more in the landscape. And it has silver foliage. What more can you ask for? All right, all right. So Quercus engelmannii. Now we're moving on to trees. What are Alejandro's trees that you need to include in the landscape? I think if you have the opportunity, the resources, and the space to plant a tree, what better tree to plant than an oak tree? And again, I know you're saying there's so many oak trees you can plant in California. That's why I recommend resources like Calscape to really get to know what are the locally occurring species in your area. But if I had to recommend an oak tree that I'm seeing is very beautiful in the landscape, tolerates drought, um, lends itself well to planting underneath, it would be the Engelmann oak or the Quercus engelmannii, which actually is a narrow endemic. It has it's now extirpated from most of its range, and some of the only heritage trees you can actually find in Pasadena and the San Gabriel Valley down in the LA area. But it's such a beautiful tree. It's very upright. It has a beautiful canopy. But I've really learned to appreciate this tree because I've seen it tolerate drought really well. It seems to be resilient to some of the changes we're seeing in our climate. So as much as people want to plant the live oak or Quercus agrifolia, we're starting to think about other oaks that we can bring into the area, especially if we start to think about warming climates and what models are predicting for some of the ranges of those plants. Is the range for our coast live oak going to be shifted by climate change? So those are questions that we're trying to investigate, especially through our projects at Ealing's Park, seeing how novel plant communities start to adapt to climate disturbances. Western redbud. Western redbud is a great small tree to include in the landscape. We love it at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. And I was very recently made aware of the fact that its pink flowers actually resemble little hummingbirds. And that is the cutest thing I've ever been told. So thank you so much to Phoebe, one of our gardeners at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, who actually told me that. So that's really, really cool. But I especially like this tree. It is winter deciduous, but even during its deciduous or dormant state, I think it has so much beauty that the plant offers through its sculptural form and those bare branches. And then our last tree that I want to highlight that I feel that I've seen planted in landscapes and oftentimes you can find in an abundant number of sizes is our desert willow. It's such a beautiful shrub that comes from the Southwest region. You usually find this one growing in desert washes out in the much more arid desert areas. But just take a look at these flowers. This one is actually in the Bignoniaceae family. So, I mean, those flowers are pretty representative of that group of plants, but I especially love this plant because it looks like this in the heat of summer. So this is a plant that's going to attract hummingbirds. It's going to invite all sorts of wildlife, and it's a fast-growing tree that I've seen either people like to treat it or maintain it as a multi-trunk tree or even a single trunk tree. So there's so many ways these kinds of trees can adapt to the urban built environment. So, thank you. My name is Alejandro Lemus, horticultural educator at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, and please let me know if you have any questions. There's my email. Again, we're doing a lot at the Botanic Garden, but the one project I really am focusing on right now is how can we connect landscapers, both who speak English and are from Spanish-speaking populations, with this knowledge? Because I know that there are many groups out there who are now being tasked to work with native plants, either through landscaping companies, institutions, other municipalities, but we want to make sure that we're able to connect with that group and make sure that we're providing them with that resource. So it's something that I'm really stoked to continue doing a lot of work on and continuing to spread the message about native plants and how we can educate and make our landscaping force more aware of how to garden with native plants. So again, thank you to the Channel Islands chapter CMPS for having me this evening. And I think we have about 10 minutes left, but I'm happy to take questions or engage in some discussion.
Thank you, Alejandro. That was really lovely. And you can't hear the applause, but there's 40 people clapping for you.
Oh, okay. I hear it. I hear it. Yeah. Of
Thanks so much for sharing and for your expertise. Um,
course.
yeah, we're welcoming questions right now, either by putting them into the chat or by turning your camera on and asking Alejandro directly. But while people are warming up to that, Alejandro, I have a question for you, which is that a critique we get in native plant world a lot that you alluded to in the beginning of your talk was the availability of native plants. And I'm wondering if if you can speak to that while we're getting those questions queued up.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's the number one reason I think what's the number one reason that stops people from planting native plants. As I mentioned, I worked in a nonprofit retail nursery for many, many years prior to coming up to Santa Barbara. And I've told so many people so many times, hey, sorry, we just sold out of Urbina de la Mina. I can't provide you with 50. And it's always a bummer because there's the demand is there, but how can we start to bring up the supply? So it is a question that we're currently investigating at the Botanic Garden. And we also want to start to tap into schools like La Colina Junior High in Santa Barbara, who actually have greenhouses and spaces for growing plants and providing that outdoor learning opportunity for children. So we just want to continue to empower people to how to grow plants from seed. Because I think oftentimes people are intimidated and they don't realize how simple it can be for some species. So that is one route that we want to start to connect with schools and other organizations in the area and how we can show them how to grow plants, because I think nurseries, it's important that they have them, but how can we address that issue faster? I think we're definitely starting to look at schools or other spaces that we can encourage people to grow more native plants. So I don't have a full fleshed out answer, but it is something we're thinking about, how you can increase that native plant supply. Yeah.
Yeah, Terry.
Hi. So just to feed off of that, so this past year in the California legislature, it died in committee, but there was a bill that would require commercial landscaping to use native plants. And I was really hopeful on that supply side that that would really help. So I think this can be reintroduced again this year, and we should all really try to support it because if landscapers for commercial property are required to use native plants, I think that'll hugely, stimulate the native plant commercial industry, which is what we really need. I mean, my local, not quite big box nursery green thumb has some natives, but
Mm.
in their native plant section, it's mostly water wise. It's not actually native plants. And that's one of the things maybe you could address how you speak to people about the difference between native plants and water wise plants.
Yeah, that's a very good question, you know, and one thing I'm thinking back to our certification, so the California Native Plant Certification, we encourage the use of native plants, but we also let people know that the California floristic province, like where we live here in California, this isn't a climate that's unique just to California. This Mediterranean climate, or I prefer to call it a summer dry climate, is shared by other regions in the world, right? So there from those regions like the Mediterranean Sea, you're going to find plants that come from similar conditions, similar environmental conditions here in California. And oftentimes those plants are brought here and are marketed as water-wise plants or California-friendly plants. And hey, I won't scold someone for planting that kind of plant, but it is an opportunity to educate the public about, yes, it's true that that plant is going to be won't require much water because it's from a summer dry climate, but really starting to think about and frame the conversation in a way where we're starting to talk about the habitat value of plants and really starting to highlight that California native plants, they're not only unique and actually preferable to plant because they're going to help reduce your water costs down the line, but also because there's millions of years of coevolution between our invertebrates, between our flora, that they need each other. There's this really tight interdependency. And that's one message that we really are starting to drive home through our classes and our programming, really getting people to appreciate ground in California, the habitat value of these plants. And that is the one difference when we're talking about California native versus California friendly. It's those tightly linked connections that the flora has with the invertebrates and the pollinators. Penny, your hand is up.
Yes, thanks. Been a great appreciate this. So I moved where we live in a retirement community in Santa Barbara, and it has an established, 15, 20-year garden crew that uses reclaimed water. And I get a lot of pushback when trying to towards directing more native plants on campus.
Mm.
That lots of native plants. First of all, they don't want to do anything other than a drip line.
Uh,
Drip line kills so many plants. But the thing I pushback I get is that is not the drip line, which I
mm.
believe drip line kills a lot of natives, but it's the reclaimed water. And I'm wondering, resources for what can do well with reclaimed water, really sensitive plants that don't like reclaimed water. Is it an issue? Anything around that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, not that I know of specifically, but I do want to provide some resources. I know Santa Barbara County has a manual for gardening and for gray water. I'll try to provide the link for that after the class if I can find it. But native plants, I want to address a couple aspects or components of your question. So one thing we strive to discuss in the native plant certification is irrigation, right? Irrigation is super important when it comes to native plant establishment. I always like to say that if you experience plant decline or plant failure in the first 6 months after planting a plant, it's more than likely due to underwatering or overwatering. It always has to do with water. And oftentimes people will say, don't use drip. Drip is evil. Drip is bad. And I'm here to tell you that that may not be true. So one thing that we encourage people to do is really not resource, research different irrigation systems because systems like drip actually have benefits given the landscape. If you're working with slopes or narrow areas where you don't want to see a lot of runoff or water not infiltrating into the ground, that those may be scenarios where you may want to consider drip. And even then, I think the one mistake people make with drip is that they turn the drip on every day and you end up rotting the crown of the plant. That's not what native plants want. You also want to remember that native plants, they want infrequent and deep soaks of water. So to achieve that, you want to make sure that you're utilizing your drip line long enough and infrequently enough to moisten the root ball and let it dry down before watering your plants. And then just regarding the reclamation, what do plants tolerate reclaimed water? It really depends. I've seen native plants do really well, like in rain gardens, gray water systems, or in swales where people are diverting like dishwasher water or laundry water into their landscapes, especially areas that are planted with plants, especially native plants that appreciate that water. So I would say if you're going to go for that, I would recommend using riparian plants or plants that come from streamside habitats like our California wild rose, maybe even yarrow, western redbud, plants that maybe tolerate a higher level of water would be my suggestion. And I hope that provides some clarity, Kenny. Cool. All right.
And we have a little bit of time on the end of this if there are any remaining questions. And please feel free to reach out to Alejandro about the landscaper certification program that's offered, or about the websites that were in the presentation. Those links,
Yes.
they can be shared. And Alejandro, I see your emails right here, and people could also probably hunt you down on the garden's website. Terry, do you have a question?
I have one that hopefully will be of interest to other people as well. But I know a number of landscapers and have used a number of landscapers, and they're so shy of native plants. Do you have like, the elevator pitch for how you convince, a good sized landscaping firm to invest and maybe send a couple of their people to the landscaping program, native plants landscaping program?
Yeah, that's a very good question. That is currently what we want to do to continue to engage the greater Santa Barbara Ventura communities in this kind of curriculum. But what I have seen works best for this is really approaching groups, landscaping crews that are either doing landscaping for universities like UCSB or UCLA, thinking about different municipalities like Santa Barbara Airport, the Parks Department here, the landscapers who are working for the Parks Department, and really starting to target those groups. And I think it's beneficial here in Santa Barbara because I think people are open to planting more plants. But if I had like a quick pitch, it would be that these plants help save water. And I think that's nowadays what people want to do. People are invited into native plants for many different reasons. I there's many ways we got here. Either we were curious about how to save water, right? We want to do some water conservation. You don't want to use as much water anymore. For some people, it's about charismatic species like the monarch butterfly, and they hear the story about milkweed, and they're like, "I love butterflies. I've always loved butterflies." And I'm like, "Great, plant native milkweed, not the tropical milkweed. Or if you are going to plant tropical, make sure you cut it back in the wintertime." So making sure that there's many different avenues for people to relate to native plants, I have found best that works best. Even just teaching people about the medicinal or the edible value of native plants is one way to engage people. I know, just speaking from my personal experience, my parents, when I first told them about native plants, this and that, they're like, "What?" But I started to teach them like, hey, you can actually make a tea out of sage leaves, or you can actually process the elderberry fruits and you can actually utilize them. So I can go down a rabbit hole here as to why I love and appreciate and why I think everyone should plant native plants. But I think it's really important to emphasize that there's multiple reasons why people would find native plants, and making sure that you let people discover that on their own, really making people having people make that connection. And when people make that connection to a native plant, that's how you know they're in it for good. Those are the meaningful connections we want to make. So that's my long-winded answer.
Thank you, Alejandro. And thanks everyone for coming to today's chapter meeting. It's been a while since we've had so many lovely events that have taken place for a chapter meeting. I really look forward to seeing you all next month for a in-person meeting where we're going to learn about monarchs. So stay tuned, and I look forward to seeing you all there. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Alejandro. Really appreciate your time sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Again, I work at Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, so please come by and say hi and take a look at all the classes we have on our calendar. And you have a gardener who wants to take the certification, let me know. If you have a gardener who wants to take the certification, pay for them to take it. So you can learn more about it on our website.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Cool.
Thanks, Alejandro.
Have a good